Hi, my name is Muhammad Fakri Salman bin Muhammad Faizal, and this is my partner, Nofarisha Aliana binti Muhammad Fazli, and we are here to present our group research project, which is engagement, which is inspiring sports events, volunteer, engagement, sense of pride, and continued volunteering intention and among university students. Good morning everyone. Our research topic is the relationship between volunteer engagement, sense of pride and continued voluntary intention among university students. Volunteering is important because it helps the community and helps students learn new skills. However, many students stop volunteering after joining only a few activities. This study wants to understand why some students continue volunteering while others do not. We focus on two factors, which is volunteer engagement and sense of pride. The aim of this study is to find out whether these factors influence students' intention to continue volunteering in the future. Hi, the first research problem is that although university provides many volunteer opportunities, many students do not continue volunteering after their initial participation. Therefore, we need to identify the factors that encourage long-term volunteer involvement. The second research problem is that previous studies in Malaysia have given limited attention to the role of sense of pride. We still do not know whether feeling proud after volunteering motivates university students to continue volunteering. In case, for example, the volunteering is about the pride and the sense of our humanity. The third research problem is that previous studies mainly focus on why students started volunteering, such as their motivation and participation. However, they paid less attention to the psychological factors that encourage students to continue volunteering. The fourth research problem is that universities still lack clear evidence about what motivates students to remain active volunteering. As a result, they face challenges in developing effective volunteer retention strategies. The research gap one simplifies that most studies in Malaysia focus on why university students start volunteering, but few studies examine that why they choose to continue volunteering in the future. Therefore, more research is needed on continued voluntary intention among Malaysian university students, while research gap 2 examines that previous studies mainly focused on volunteer motivation and satisfaction. However, there is limited research on how volunteer engagement and sense of pride influence students' intention to continue volunteering, especially in Malaysian university. The third research gap explains about the very few studies examined whether feeling proud encourages students to continue volunteering. For example, after helping flood victims, a student feels proud of making a difference. Researchers still do not know whether this feeling of pride motivates the students to volunteer again. And the fourth research gap explains about the most volunteer retention studies come from other countries, while there are still few studies in Malaysia. For example, many studies on volunteer retention have been conducted in China, the United States, and Australia, but there are fewer studies involving Malaysian university students. Therefore, more Malaysian research is needed. And therefore, this study aims to fill these gaps by investigating the relationship between volunteer engagement, sense of pride, and continued voluntary intention among university students. This is our main objective, which is research objective first is to understand the role of volunteer engagement, sense of pride, continued voluntary intention, and continued voluntary intention among university students, while research objective 2 is to investigate the relationship between voluntary engagement, sense of pride, and continued voluntary intention among university students. This is our research framework. Our research framework divided by two, which is independent variables and independent variables. The independent variables is the voluntary engagement and sense of pride, while the dependent variables is the continued voluntary intention. This is about our study variables, which contains the sense of pride, demographic level, continued voluntary intention, and the voluntary engagement. First, the demographic information. The demographic information contains about the age, gender, job scope, and the level of study. While the voluntary engagement is the survey for volunteer for before, during, and after the volunteering day. The third one is the sense of pride. The sense of pride is the positive self-conscious emotion that occurs when individuals evolve for their actions and or achievements for valuable, meaningful, or consistent performance with their personal value. And the last one is the continued voluntary intention. Continued voluntary intention is the likelihood that a person who has already volunteered intends to volunteer again in the future. This is about our study variables, which contains the sense of pride, demographic level, continued voluntary intention, and the voluntary engagement. First, the demographic information. The demographic information contains about the age, gender, job scope, and the level of study. While the voluntary engagement is the survey for volunteer for before, during, and after the volunteering day. The third one is the sense of pride. The sense of pride is the positive self-conscious emotion that occurs when individuals evolve for their actions and or achievements for valuable, meaningful, or consistent performance with their personal value. And the last one is the continued voluntary intention. Continued voluntary intention is the likelihood that a person who has already volunteered intends to volunteer again in the future.
Next, I will present the research hypothesis for this study. The first hypothesis proposes that volunteer engagement has a positive and significant influence on continued volunteering intention among university student volunteers. Volunteer engagement refers to the level of enthusiasm, involvement, and psychological connection that volunteers experience will carry out their responsibilities. According to ZIA 2024, volunteers who are active, engaged, are more likely to continue volunteering in future sport events. According U 2022, found that engaged volunteers develop stronger emotional attachment and greater intention to volunteer again. The second hypothesis proposes that sense of pride has a positive and significant influence on continued volunteering intention. Sense of pride reflects volunteer feeling of achievement, self-worth, and belonging of the contribute to an event. ZIA 2024 demonstrates that volunteers who feel proud of their contribution are more willing to participate in future volunteering activities. In addition, Guzman and Elmers 2007 explained that pride strength volunteer commitment and encourage future volunteering participation. Therefore, this study proposes that both volunteer engagement and sense of pride positive influence continued volunteering intention among student volunteers in South UiTM Puncak Adult. A quantitative research approved because the objective is to examine the relationship between volunteer engagement, sense of pride, and continued volunteering intention. A cross-sectional research design will be used, where data are collected from respondents at one point in time. The research instrument is a structured questionnaire distributed online through Google Form. The participants on this study are UiTM Puncak Alam students who have volunteered in sport event. The collected data will later be analyzed using HTM616 to test the proposed hypothesis and examine the relationship among the study variable. For the sampling procedure, this study applies non-probability purposive sampling. Purposive sampling is selected because only respondents with relevant volunteering experience are able to provide meaningful information for this study. The sampling frame consists of UiTM Puncak Alam students who have volunteered in sport events. Therefore, the target respondents are students who fulfill the inclusion criteria established for this research. The respondent must fulfill 3 inclusion criteria. First, they must be current UiTM Puncak Alam students. Second, they must be 18 years old and above. Third, they must have participated as volunteer in at least one sport event within the past 6 months. These criteria ensure that every respondent has recent and relevant volunteering experience, allowing them to provide relevant information for this. Data for this study will be collected using a structured online questionnaire through Google Form. The questionnaire consists of 3 structures. Volunteer engagement and sense of pride are the independent variable, while continued volunteering intention is the dependent variable. A 5-point Likert scale ranging from 1 strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree will be used to measure respondent perception. This approach allows data to be collected efficiently from a large number of respondents. Before the actual survey is conducted, the questionnaire will first undergo an expert review to confirm its content validity. Next, a pilot test will be carried out to assess the reliability of the measurement item. After the actual data collection, descriptive analysis will be used to summarize respondent demographic profile. Subsequently, HTM616 analysis will be conducted to evaluate the measurement model, assess the structure model, and test the proposed research hypothesis. This study contributes theoretically in 2 ways. First, it extends the framework proposed by ZIA 2024 by applying it to the context of university student volunteer in Malaysian sport event, particularly South UiTM Puncak Alam. Second, this study contributes empirical evidence on the influence of volunteer engagement and sense of pride on continued volunteering intention within the Malaysia higher education context, where research on student sport volunteer remain limited. From a practical perspective, this study also provides several important contributions. First, the finding can assist South UiTM Puncak Alam in improving volunteer recruitment, engagement, and retention strategies. It may also help organize create a more positive volunteering experience that encourages students to continue volunteering in future sport events. Second, the finding can assist university in developing more effective volunteer management programs. This will support better planning and management of future university sport events through stronger volunteer participation and long-term volunteer retention.